If Framber Valdez is just going to continue to sit there in free agency, will the Orioles have to pivot? And could that pivot be to Zac Gallen? We'll talk about that coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, January 29th, 2026, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we're going to talk about the Orioles' reported interest in free agent starting pitcher Zac Gallen. And while he's not the best guy out there that the O's are connected to, of course, that is still Framber Valdez, we'll talk about why Gallen may or may not be a good pivot if Valdez just kind of continues to hold out in free agency. Then we will run through a ton of news and notes surrounding the Orioles and teams around the league that kind of connect to Baltimore's offseason plans and some old friends who have been in the news over the past couple of days. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Before we get there, though, just did want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day and for making Locked On now the #1 sports podcast network. So we begin with the really only Orioles straight up news I think that we've gotten this week, and that is that the O's have some interest in Zac Gallen, 30-year-old right-handed starting pitcher who is a free agent for the first time this offseason. And if you would have told me a year ago, now he was still under contract with the Diamondbacks for another year at that point, but if you would have told me a year ago the Orioles have some serious interest in Zac Gallen, if you would have even told me a year ago, hey, next offseason the O's are going to be in on Zac Gallen, I would have been ecstatic. I would have been like, the O's are getting pretty close to a legit #1 guy, at least as close as you can get with some people still having some questions. Because when you look at what Gallen did when he really broke out onto the scene in 2022, now to be fair to Zac Gallen, he debuted in 2019, and he did have a 2.81 ERA in 15 starts that year, and then had a 2.75 in 12 starts in 2020. So he was pretty much still on the scene, took a little bit of a step back in 2021, but in 2022 is when he arrived as like maybe a true #1 in baseball. 31 starts, 184 innings, and a 2.54 ERA for the Diamondbacks in 2022. He then threw 210 innings the next year and helped lead the Diamondbacks to the World Series in 2023, and still had a good year in 24 with a 3.65 ERA. And you're looking around and you're like, this guy's going to hit free agency at 30, and he is going to get a ton of money with the way he looks. And now, not so much. Gallen coming off a year where he did stay healthy and he did eat innings. He made 33 starts. He threw 192 innings for the Diamondbacks last year. That was a career high. But his ERA spiked to 4.83. His FIP spiked to 4.50. His strikeout rate went down. He gave up a lot more homers. The stuff went down as well. He was not the same pitcher at all, which is one of the big reasons why here in late January, Gallen is still a free agent. So John Heyman did do the reporting earlier this week that the Orioles, along with the Cubs and his old team, the Diamondbacks, are showing interest right now in Zac Gallen. Of course, the D-backs would have interest with Gallen being with them forever. And the Cubs have basically been connected to Gallen all winter. That was just the assumption that he would sign with Chicago. But since then, they did trade for Edward Cabrera, maybe less of an opening in their rotation. Now, I currently have Zac Gallen #3 on my mid-rotation starter free agent wish list that I did earlier this offseason. You can kind of, if you're watching here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, you'll see the spreadsheet I am throwing up now of the starters who are available. Again, Framber Valdez, the only one of the 5 of the top-tier starters still available. Gallen was my #3 of mid-rotation starters. His former teammate, Merrill Kelly, I had #1. Chris Bassett, who is still a free agent, at #2. And then Zac Gallen, #3, followed by Cody Ponce, #4, who went to Toronto. Justin Verlander at 5, who the O's have been connected to and is still a free agent. And then Zach Eflin at 6, who the Orioles did re-sign to a 1-year, $10 million deal earlier this offseason. And then Lucas Giolito, Zach Littell, Nick Martinez also on the list and are still out there at this point as we almost enter February in terms of free agent starting pitchers. Now, for me, Gallen is kind of the guy I have as the cutoff right now. You look at Valdez, absolutely in, makes the Orioles rotation better. You look at some of the top starters available via trade, Joe Ryan, Sandy Alcantara, Pablo Lopez, if those guys are moved, even a Nick Pivetta or a Chris Bubich, if those guys are moved, I'm on board. I'm like, they make the Orioles rotation better. Right now, they would be one of the Orioles' top 5 starters, even though the O's do have at least a solid, okay rotation after they've signed Zach Eflin and traded for Shane Baz. But any of those guys, I think, yep, you put them in there, they're an upgrade over what they have. The 2 guys I kind of have on the bubble are 2 and 3 on the mid-rotation starter list, and that is Chris Bassitt and Zac Gallen. And I've said throughout the offseason, once the O's already had Baz and already had Eflin, if their last move was Bassitt or Gallen, I think I'd be okay with it, because I think both of those guys would be an upgrade over what they have right now. I think really the line is for the Orioles, because there are still some injury questions obviously swirling around Zach Eflin, so that's why you still do want another starting pitcher. The question is this guy better or worse than Dean Kremer? Dean Kremer is kind of slotted in to be the Orioles' number 4 starter right now. He's shown himself to be just a great 4 or 5 starter for the past couple of years. If he's equal or better than Dean Kremer, I think he makes your team better. Zac Gallen last year didn't show that he's better than Dean Kremer, but the overall body of work makes me feel like he certainly can be. Chris Bassitt is a very Dean Kremer-like pitcher, maybe a half step ahead of Kremer, which makes me okay if they were to sign him, although it feels just kind of like overkill at the back end of the rotation, which is how I would feel about the O's signing Justin Verlander. Talked about that on an episode last week when the Orioles were showing some interest. But I will say I'd be okay with a Gallen signing. It wouldn't be my favorite, right? You're still looking at Framber Valdez. The Orioles still have interest. They may even have an offer out there that they're waiting for. This could be a message to Framber Valdez, like, hey, we are willing to go after other pitchers if you're not going to do anything. Maybe Framber's only getting 3 or 4 year offers at 32 years old with the concerns from what happened last year. And maybe he wants 6 years and he's just going to sit there and wait in free agency until he gets closer to what he wants years-wise or money-wise. Nobody really knows, honestly, why Valdez has not signed at this point, and most expect him, at least in the media, it seems, to sign with the Orioles, and it makes the most sense for him to sign with the Orioles. Really, the Giants seem to be the only other team in there, but if he's going to sit out and wait, the Orioles should pivot. They should at least add one more arm going into the season, even if it's not going to be Valdez, to make this rotation better, and at the very least give it more depth, because we know how much depth can quickly crumble when it comes to starting pitching. So Zac Gallen, right, 30 years old. He does have the qualifying offer attached, so the Orioles would lose a draft pick if they signed him. Now, it's not a very high draft pick, but it's somewhere in the 80s. It's still a valuable pick, and a guy coming off a year that bad, you also want to give up a draft pick. This could be like kind of a 2-year prove-it deal that I could see Zac Gallen signing, maybe even with an opt-out to rebuild his value and then get that big money contract he would have gotten if you were a free agent last year. But I mean, again, if you look at those 3 seasons, 2022 to 24, it's a 3.2 ERA in 93 starts with good strikeout to walk numbers. Like, that was everything you want out of the starter. The only injury was a lower body thing. He had a hamstring injury in 2024 that caused him to miss, close to a month. That's really been it in that stretch. I mean, even when he was bad last year, he was fully healthy in 2025. So he checks all those boxes, except for just a disaster season leading up to free agency. And maybe a good pitcher is still in there, right? He's only 30. His stuff overall looks basically the same as it did in 2024 when he posted a 3.65 ERA, much more like what you would want out of someone like Zac Gallen. He still did have an injury. He still wasn't the same pitcher that year. But the stuff also took a large drop off from 2023 to 2024. It's definitely down. Now, he didn't really lose command. I mean, his walk rate got a little bit better, although, again, dropped off from the good years of 22 and 23. So there's a little bit of, was 2024 just kind of smoke and mirrors, smaller sample size with the injury, and then the full drop-off came in 2025. That is a possibility. The home run rate spiked on him last year. That's something that can certainly fluctuate, but he gave up more homers on a rate basis than he ever had. Lance Brozdowski has done some really good breakdowns of Zac Gallen so far this offseason, like how teams can fix him if they sign him in free agency. Gallen did add a sinker for the first time in 2025. It was a pitch to combat right-handed hitters a little bit more. It's something that both Dean Kremer and Kyle Bradish did earlier in their career, to have a fastball that was better against righties, and it worked for both of them. So maybe it can continue to work for Gallen. And Gallen did look more like his normal self later in the year. In the first 4 months of the season through July, He had a 5.60 ERA and a 4.79 FIP. In August and September, Gallen had a 3.32 ERA with a 3.95 FIP. It wasn't back to fully dominant Gallen, but if you can get that 2-month guy over a long stretch, you're perfectly happy with having Zac Gallen in your rotation. He was also struggling against lefties at times last year, so he upped the use of his changeup, which is his main weapon against lefties, used it more and more in those final 2 months, which really led to better stats overall. And Lance Brozdowski has talked about maybe adding more of like a death ball type curveball against lefties. I think the curveball that Gallen has right now to go along with that changeup, I think that changeup doesn't get enough respect. I think it's a really good pitch. He could even throw more if he comes to Baltimore. And the O's could at least get him down to like a high 3 ERA guy who really helps your rotation. Is he ever going to be the guy who looked like a legit Cy Young type in 2022 and 23 in Arizona? That's the big question, if he can ever get back to that. But I think he's going to be better than he showed in 2025. The question is, are you really willing to lose a draft pick on a 1 to 2 year deal? Again, I don't see Zac Gallen signing a 4-year contract because I think he knows he's so much better than he showed last season. He will want to hit the free agent market again, coming off a much more Zac Gallen-like year. And he could get, I mean, if he shows for a year or two that he is what he was a couple of years ago, he could get something close to like the 7-year, $210 million contract that Dylan Cease got earlier this offseason. That's completely possible for him if he doesn't have the year that he had right before free agency. So, I mean, pre-2025 Gallen, that's absolutely a number 2 at the very least in your rotation. 2025 Zac Gallen, worse than Dean Kramer. So for him crossing the Dean Kramer line, it's a tough conversation. I mean, if the Orioles did sign Gallen, you're probably looking at a rotation of Bradish, Rogers, Boz, Gallen, Kramer, and then that feels good. It feels better than it is right now. It allows Zach Eflin to probably begin the year on the injured list, maybe come back in a month with some depth. I'm sure another starter will be injured at that point because that's just the reality of pitching in Major League Baseball. He makes the Orioles better. There's certainly upside to unlock, and the team would be better tomorrow than they were today if they signed Zac Gallen. I just am so concerned with the stuff drop off the last 2 years and the abysmal 2025 that he had that I wouldn't pour big time money into him. I wouldn't feel great losing a draft pick to sign him. But at the end of the day, if the Orioles make the move, that tells me, 1, that they are confident that they can have him bounce back. 2, he still does make the team better. And 3, it tells me the talks between Framber Valdez and maybe not just the Orioles, but every team out there have just come to such an annoying point. They were ready to move on, and I would kind of understand that move if they made it. So we'll see if there is that legitimate interest between the Orioles and Zac Gallen. But there are a lot of pieces of not just Orioles news and notes, but news and notes across the league that I wanted to get to. None of them were big enough to make a full episode around them, but a bunch of them I just wanted to touch on here, a podcast near the end of the week. So we'll start to get to those right after this. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by TurboTax. Tax season doesn't have to take over your life. This year, TurboTax is making it easier than ever to just hand things off and move on with your day. With TurboTax Full Service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert start to finish without the stress or the guesswork. So instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They will handle everything and work to get you every deduction. And for a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in if a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year. All you got to do is file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life. Visit TurboTax.com/local to book your appointment today. So we're basically going to use the rest of this episode to just run through a ton of news and notes relating strictly to the Orioles and then kind of tangentially to the Orioles as moves have been made across baseball over the past few days or so. So I guess let's begin with the more Orioles specific stuff. And the first one is kind of the best thing that we heard out of Birdland Caravan. Of course, most of the caravan was canceled due to the snowstorm that came in last weekend. They got the Thursday and Friday events in, but after that, they, for good reason, canceled the Saturday events, even though the snow didn't really come till late Saturday night. I think it was smart to not have, especially the players, fly in and kind of be stuck here, not be able to fly back home or fly back to Sarasota or wherever they are headed. But we did get some events where we heard from Craig Albernaz and Pete Alonso and others. And I think the best thing we heard from him, I mean, yeah, there was a lot of rah-rah and firing the fans up, and there was a lot of pandering, and it was all great. But Albernaz said last Friday that the Orioles expect Heston Kjerstad to be healthy and ready for spring training. Mike Elias had somewhat alluded to that earlier this offseason, but Albernaz saying it the way he did, just weeks before pitchers and catchers report, was the most positive update we've gotten on Kjerstad in a long time. Of course, Heston Kjerstad, 27-year-old left-handed hitting outfielder, or he will be 27 in February. Orioles first-round pick, number 2 overall out of Arkansas in the 2020 COVID draft. Ended up with myocarditis, a heart issue in 2020 that delayed the begin to his professional campaign. When he came back, he had some lower body injuries that kept him out of the lineup for a little bit. But Kjerstad finally does debut late in the 2023 season, helping the Orioles a little bit to that division title and being on the playoff roster. He comes back in 2024, and he's a part of the Orioles. He's trying to find his footing on this team. It was tough because Colton Cowser was so good in spring training. He beat out Kjerstad for an opening day roster spot. So Kjerstad had to go back to AAA, fought his way back to the big leagues. And, in 114 plate appearances, he was a 115 WRC plus hitter in the big leagues in 2024. He was showing that he belonged. And then the concussions came. Gets hit by a fastball from Clay Holmes against the Yankees, allowing the benches to clear in a game in July. It was a concussion. He was out for a while, tried to come back, then went back on the injured list with concussion symptoms, just was not himself in the second half of the season, whether he was in the big leagues or AAA after that concussion. Came back in 2025. The thought was that he was healthy. He made the Orioles opening day roster. Now, not as an everyday guy, more as a bench bat who was kind of playing here and there for the Orioles, but at least he was up in the big leagues. But it was bad. I mean, he played 54 games with 167 plate appearances, hit just 192, 240 on base, 327 slugging, walked just 3% of the time, and had a 57 WRC plus. He was 43% worse than a league average hitter. He had always been shaky defensively, but he looked downright unplayable in the outfield, out in right field when he was out there, just couldn't get any balls. It looked really bad. Everything across the board looked way worse for Kjerstad. He goes back to AAA, eventually gets shut down, put on the injured list for what the Orioles just called fatigue. They were being kind of cagey about what exactly was going on with Kjerstad. He played his last AAA game on July 25th of last year, then never appeared in a game at any level after that. But it did become clear that it was something medical that was going on. This was not a hamstring strain, whether it was from the myocarditis, whether it was from the concussion issues, something was lingering for Kjerstad, was really impacting him and was keeping him off the field. We weren't getting a lot of positive updates, and I kind of thought that there was a possibility it could be the end of Heston Kjerstad's professional baseball career. But whatever must have been happening, they've at least somewhat figured out that he's going to give it a go in spring training, and that is huge news for him. Now, how it impacts the Orioles, we will see, right? This is great news for Kjerstad, his career, and just his overall health, which obviously comes first here. Concussions, heart issues are two of the biggest things you do not want to play around with, and Kjerstad has had both of them just since being drafted by the Orioles. I want the Orioles, and hopefully they are using an abundance of caution, him and Kjerstad and the teams, but I mean, you're not really expecting much from him. I mean, you've signed Tyler O'Neill. You've now traded for Taylor Ward. You have Dylan Beavers up here. The spots Kjerstad would have been playing on the 2026 Orioles, if you thought back to 3 years ago, projected the 2026 Orioles, they've been filled by three guys who, Beavers and O'Neill and Ward, who kind of sort of weren't in those plans back then. I mean, even he was ahead of Colton Cowser at one point, and Cowser jumped him as well. So the Orioles don't really need Kjerstad. They shouldn't be relying on Kjerstad, and they aren't really at all. But maybe he's someone who could be a plus. Maybe he could be a surprise. Now, he's in his final option year, so the Orioles kind of lose the roster flexibility on Kjerstad once they get to 2027. So if he is really healthy, and again, he's going to turn 27 here in a couple weeks, this is unfortunately kind of the make or break season somewhat for Heston Kjerstad in Baltimore. If he shows he can stick, then he'll be on the roster. If he doesn't, if it's health related, I mean, who knows about his career? If it's not, but he just can't get back to it, the Orioles are going to find a way to trade him. Maybe it would be it's going to be a weird conversation a year from now if this 2026 season doesn't go well for Heston Kjerstad. But overall, it is great news that he is going to be on the field in spring training, and we just hope he's healthy And if he's as productive as he can be, this is a legit top prospect. That's another bat the Orioles just didn't know they would have, and maybe they'll get something out of in 2026. A couple other Orioles pieces. Jose Suarez, left-handed pitcher the Orioles had for a week or so off the waiver wire. He was DFA'd last week. Well, the Braves have claimed Jose Suarez off waivers. The Braves were the team that DFA'd Suarez and allowed the Orioles to get him. The Braves had to then make a roster move. They DFA'd right-handed pitcher George Soriano, who was on the Orioles earlier this season, who they claimed off waivers and then later DFA'd him. So maybe they'll claim Soriano again. Maybe Suarez will go on waivers again. The waiver wire game continues, and it also continued with Marco Luciano, who the Orioles had for a bit on waivers. They DFA'd him. The Yankees claimed him. Now the Yankees have DFA'd Marco Luciano, so maybe the Orioles go after him again. And the Yankees made that move because they claimed right-handed pitcher Dom Hamill off waivers. Dom Hamill is a pitcher who the Orioles had claimed off waivers in September and had in AAA for a bit before they DFA'd him. It is a wild ride when you jump on the waiver train. A couple other Orioles guys. Dylan Carlson has signed a minor league contract with the Chicago Cubs that'll pay him, I think, $2 million if he is in the big leagues. Of course, Carlson signed a one-year major league deal with the Orioles last offseason. It was a depth signing. He had minor league options. He began the year in AAA, didn't even make the opening day roster. But once all of the Orioles injuries began, especially in the outfield with Colton Cowser going down, Carlson ended up spending most of the year in the big leagues. Now, he was a former top prospect who had a breakout rookie season with the Cardinals, then kind of been trending in the wrong direction since then. That continued, unfortunately, in Baltimore last year for the switch hitter. Played in 83 games, 241 plate appearances, had just a 74 WRC plus, really did not impact the baseball. Defensively, he was pretty solid, and you liked having him out there, but just really didn't give you much at all on offense. The Orioles never really expected him to have to play that much, and that's what happens when your depth just gets eroded because of injuries. You end up having to play guys like Dylan Carlson way, way more than you expected. Didn't go super well. The Orioles outrighted him off the roster, and he will now get a chance to make the Cubs and back up, PCA and Seiya Suzuki and Ian Happ in that Chicago outfield. Another former Oriole from last year, Dylan Coleman, right-handed pitcher who the Orioles signed to a minor league deal last year and then released in May after he had a 5 ERA and 15 innings in Norfolk. He has signed a minor league contract with the Yankees, so he will be in spring training with them. Couple more pieces of news and notes. The next one's a little more league-wide, but they all connect back to the Orioles. Trey Mancini is going to give it one more go. Harrison Bader not signing with the Orioles, although many fans wanted that one. And we got some news about Tomoyuki Sugano. That's all coming up next to finish off the show. So we keep it going with the news and notes. Talk about Trey Mancini. How about this? Trey Mancini has agreed to a minor league deal with the Angels with an invite to big league spring training. Mancini, of course, drafted by the Orioles, came up through the system, was a big part of their teams in 2017, 2018, 2019. Then, of course, gets the life-changing news, finds out he has cancer in 2020, kind of wakes up from his procedure right as they're delaying/canceling the MLB season in 2020 due to COVID. Comes back for the Orioles in 2021. He wins Comeback Player of the Year. 2022, he's still with the O's, kind of helping them rise back to the ranks of being competitive, but the Orioles still do trade him to the Astros at the 2022 deadline. He's not a big part of the Astros and struggles with the team down the stretch, but still ends up winning a World Series ring with Houston in 2022. Does enough to sign a 2-year contract that offseason with the Cubs, but in the middle of that first year of the deal in 2023, he had a 75 WRC plus and was released by Chicago in year 1 of a 2-year deal. Briefly signed in AAA with the Reds, then was let go, was back with the Diamondbacks on a minor league deal in AAA in 2024, was hitting well, opted out of his contract in June, thought someone would sign him. No one did, and his 2024 was done, and he did not sign anywhere. Mancini did not play professional baseball in this area in 2025, but the Angels are taking a chance on him, and it's mostly because the Angels earlier this offseason hired former Orioles great and front office member Brady Anderson to be their major league hitting coach. That is his first really on-field coaching job, and it is the big league hitting coach for the Angels. Now, there was a good story in The Athletic this week about Brady Anderson and kind of all the people he helped when he was in Baltimore, not just as a player, but moved from the playing status to as kind of weird front office job. And there's kind of a worst kept secret in Baltimore about the relationships between the Angeloses and Brady Anderson, and eventually Dan Duquette and Buck Showalter in those years, where Anderson was technically a member of the front office, pretty high-ranking member of the Dan Duquette front office, but never seemed like he fully got along with any of the players in that stretch. I mean, I don't mean actual players. I mean, the GM and the front office. I mean, seemed like Angeloses liked him, which is why he was around, but he kind of got the okay to meddle in anything he wanted to. With some guys, it really worked, and he helped guys. In this story, it talks about how he really helped kind of blossom Mancini's career while he was kind of struggling as a hitter in the minor leagues. There were other players that speak very highly of Brady Anderson. There's other players that don't like him as much. There's some coaches that he really, really rubbed the wrong way when he was kind of floating around in whatever role he wanted in Baltimore, while, of course, Buck Showalter was trying to kind of have a stranglehold on everything that happened in that organization. Probably wasn't the best marriage, but there was some good, there was some bad that came out of it. It's really interesting to see that he is now the Angels hitting coach, and that relationship with Mancini, you got to think, led to Trey's minor league deal. I mean, if Trey could get back to the big leagues in 2026, that would be awesome for him. I mean, he's going to be 34 in March. Always going to be pulling for Trey Mancini no matter what, so hope this minor league deal with the Angels works out well. Speaking of other contracts, the San Francisco Giants signed Harrison Bader this week to a 2-year, $20.5 million deal. Thought he might fit with the Orioles somewhat as a right-handed center fielder option. I mean, the Orioles did sign Leody Taveras to that 1-year deal very early in the offseason to pair with Colton Cowser in center field. Bader's always been an elite defensive center fielder. He still is that, but he was really good on offense in 2025. Had a 122 WRC plus, traded to the Phillies with a big part of that team down the stretch. But that was his first good offensive season in the big league since 2021. He'd been kind of a bad hitter, good defender in that stretch. He's now into his 30s. I mean, who knows if that offensive profile will continue. Once the Orioles added Taveras, added Taylor Ward, started making other moves, someone like Harrison Bader started making less and less sense. Like, we've still brought up his name along with names like Brenton Doyle and Jake Myers if the Orioles wanted to add another center field option who hits from the right side. But Bader gets his 2-year deal for the Giants. They needed a good defensive center fielder. They really didn't have one, so he fits even better in San Francisco than he would in Baltimore. I know some O's fans wanted him. I really didn't think it was just a great fit, especially after the Taveras and Ward signing, so he goes elsewhere. Former Oriole Tomoyuki Sugano, of course, the Orioles signed him to a 1-year, $13 million contract last offseason to come over from Japan, one of the most productive pitchers in NPB history. Certainly stayed healthy in his 1 year with the Orioles. The stats maybe weren't where you want him. 30 starts, 157 innings, and a 4.64 ERA for Sugano, who's certainly one of the only guys who stayed healthy on the 2025 Orioles. You could at least count on him to be out there every 5 days. That was nice. He posted a 0.1 F4. He was basically a replacement level pitcher, which is fine for a bad team, and that's what the Orioles were. They had him eat innings. He was helpful in that way. But he's 36 years old now, and he came with a 5.36 FIP in his first big league season. That's not exactly something that a contending team is going to look for. I don't think the Orioles have been very interested in bringing Sugano back for 2026, but Sugano did speak to a Japanese outlet last week and did say he wants to stay in Major League Baseball because his former team, the Yomiuri Giants, where he's a legend, I think they want him back after kind of a tough first year in the big leagues over here. They want him back in Japan to continue to pitch well. I mean, he came off a sub-2 ERA in Japan in 2024, but he has said firmly he does not plan to go back to Japan, at least in 2026. He wants to stay in Major League Baseball, kind of finish what he started, get to the level he thinks he can be at. I don't think it's a contender, but maybe a bad team like the Rockies or the Cardinals who just need guys who are starting pitchers who can eat innings will sign Sugano to like a 1-year, $8 million deal. I'd like to see him continue to pitch. It just probably didn't go as well as the Orioles hoped in Baltimore in 2025, and doubt he will be back here. Final piece of news I got to get to is Hanser Alberto, who announced his retirement this week at the age of 33. Real ball knowers know Hanser Alberto is one of the only watchable players on the 2019 and 2020 Orioles. Orioles got him off waivers before the 2019 season from the Rangers, where he'd been like a solid part of their playoff teams as a utility guy for a little bit. He played 139 games, 550 plate appearances. He was a 95 WRC plus. He was about a league average hitter in 2019, but he was fun to watch. He had a 2.1 WAR. He was good on defense in multiple positions. He had a super low 9% strikeout rate, and he hit 398 against left-handed pitchers in 2019. That was second best in baseball. It was awesome to see him out there just dunking singles into right field against lefties. He was pretty much an everyday player in the shortened season for the O's in 2020, played 54 games. Offense fell off a little bit to an 87 WRC plus. Defense got worse, but he still hit 375 against lefties, and batting average-wise was the best hitter in baseball against left-handers between 2019 and 2020. Orioles penny pinching to the limit back then during the rebuild under John Angelos, non-tendered Alberto to save like $1 million or $2 million. It was annoying because he was a watchable player. The Orioles were still bad in 2021, but they didn't have Hanser Alberto to watch. He went to the Royals in 21, the Dodgers in 2022, the White Sox in 2023, but he got worse every year. Hit 238 in the Mexican League in 2025. He's still playing in the Dominican Winter League, which just ended, but Alberto is now calling it quits. We salute him for, again, nothing close to a Hall of Fame or even a good career, but a fun career to watch for some really dark times in Baltimore with the Orioles in 2019 and 2020. One of the very few players I actually enjoyed watching during the rebuild, and we wish Hanser Alberto the best in whatever is next for him, baseball or not, in his career and his life. That will do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let me know here in the comments what you think about Zac Gallen. If the Orioles aren't going to get Framber Valdez, would you be okay with a Zac Gallen signing? And make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. If you are a listener, make sure to subscribe, follow the show, leave a 5-star rating and a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. That really helps us out. And of course, if you have any thoughts on the Orioles, you want to talk some ball, ask some questions, just reach out. That is lockedonorioles@gmail.com. And of course, if you want to get even more Locked On Orioles, you can check out the Everydayer Club. It's built for you. You can get Locked On Orioles ad-free, members-only Discord access to talk with me and other O's fans at any time, and more. Just head to lockedonorioles.supercast.com or check out the link down in the show notes to learn more about joining the Everydayer Club. That'll do it for today's episode. More than likely have one more pod coming up to you on Friday afternoon. We're going to dive into some more relievers who are going to be on the roster bubble for the Orioles, like one of my breakout candidates in 2026 in Yarmiel Geraldo, unless, of course, we get some bigger news. Then, of course, we will address that on a Friday episode. Either way, I'm back tomorrow. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.